The Bleacher Report app is your destination for sports. Right now, the NBA's heating up, March Madness is here, and MLB is almost back. Every day there's a new headline, a new highlight, a new moment you've got to see for yourself. That's why I stay locked in with the Bleacher Report app. For me, it's about staying connected to my sports. I can follow the teams I care about, get real-time scores, breaking news, and highlights all in one place. Download the Bleacher Report app today so you never miss a moment.
Look around your next conference room. If there are, say, 10 people sitting at that table, 7 of them are actively biting their tongues.
7 out of 10. It's a staggering image when you really visualize it.
It really is. I mean, 7 out of 10 people are just watching the conversation happen, maybe even watching a bad decision being made, and they're actively choosing silence.
Just nodding along, totally checked out.
Right. And according to Gallup, only 30% of U.S. employees strongly agree that their opinions actually count at work. So welcome to another Custom Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, to all you listeners out there, we are exploring a massive systemic failure in how we communicate. And more importantly, we're looking at the specific architecture required to fix it. We are unpacking a fascinating research paper by Dr. Jonathan H. Westover on discussion, leadership, empathy, and psychological safety.
Yeah, and organizations have known for decades that psychological safety, which is a term originally coined by Amy Edmondson, is the absolute bedrock of a high-performing team. We know it works.
Right, but the puzzle that has just completely paralyzed so many companies is the execution. Like, how do everyday people actually create it?
Exactly. How do you sit in a mundane Tuesday morning status update and build that safety from scratch? And that is actually why I've set my visual backdrop today to look like a bustling, open-plan Japanese corporate office.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we're honoring some recent behavioral research out of Japan, specifically by Sakamoto and colleagues, that has finally handed us the 2 missing keys to this whole puzzle.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the solution, we really have to look at why that specific cultural backdrop is so revealing, right? We aren't just talking about a team putting a ping pong table in the break room and calling themselves safe.
Oh, far from it. The Japanese workplace actually provides the perfect high-stakes laboratory for this because of 2 deeply ingrained cultural norms.
Right, I remember reading about this.
Yeah, so the first is wa, which translates to a profound emphasis on group harmony. And the second is nemawashi, which is this practice of quietly building consensus one-on-one before a formal meeting ever takes place.
So nobody wants to rock the boat in public.
Exactly. In a culture operating on those rules, open disagreement in a public setting isn't just rude, it's a fundamental disruption of the social order. It's systematically suppressed.
Wow.
So the researchers asked a really brilliant question. In an environment where speaking up is socially terrifying, how do you ever build the psychological safety to take a risk?
I mean, you would need a massive counterforce, right? Something powerful enough to override the fear of breaking that harmony.
And they found it. It boils down to 2 distinct observable communication behaviors.
Yeah.
And the first one is empathy.
Empathy, which, we often treat as this fuzzy kind of esoteric concept.
Right, but in this context, it's the relational, affective dimension of communication. It's the active, observable process of understanding a colleague's feelings, validating their perspective, and projecting relational warmth.
So, in a highly rigid environment, empathy is basically the only bridge that makes it safe enough to admit you don't know something.
Precisely. But that brings us to the second behavior, which is discussion leadership.
And we should clarify, discussion leadership has absolutely nothing to do with being the boss or having a fancy title, right?
Not at all. It's the structural cognitive dimension of the conversation. It's the ability to clarify a muddy point, synthesize 3 different opposing views, and engineer the conversation so that, say, the quietest person in the room is brought into the fold.
That structural piece seems so vital because empathy makes people feel safe enough to open their mouths, but discussion leadership dictates whether anything useful actually happens once they start talking.
You hit the nail on the head.
The way these 2 mechanisms work together, it actually reminds me of building a house.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, if a team's adaptability is a house, empathy is pouring the concrete foundation. You're stabilizing the ground beneath the team so that when the soil inevitably shifts, like when a crisis hits or a project fails, the whole team doesn't just collapse into a sinkhole of finger pointing.
Right. Right.
But you can't live on a concrete slab. So discussion leadership is building the actual wooden framing. It gives you the load-bearing walls, the architecture, the actual rooms to work inside. I mean, a wooden frame built on mud will fall over, but a concrete slab without a frame is just a parking lot.
What's fascinating here is that the behavioral data perfectly maps to that structural analogy.
Really?
Yeah. The researchers uncovered what they call the dual pathway pattern.
Huh.
Empathy acts entirely on that foundation. It's the primary driver of psychological safety.
Okay.
But discussion leadership bypasses that and directly drives something called adaptive attitudes, which is a team's collective willingness to embrace change, pivot quickly, and navigate total ambiguity.
Wait, so discussion leadership drives adaptability entirely independent of psychological safety?
Yes. And that is a massive paradigm shift. It moves communication from this vague soft skill bucket into a highly precise diagnostic tool.
Oh, wow.
Because it raises an important question, right? What happens when a team is incredibly safe, everyone loves each other, they feel totally heard, but they still can't innovate to save their lives?
Well, organizations usually just prescribe more team-building retreats or, like, trust exercises.
Exactly. But the data says that team doesn't need more concrete. Their foundation is fine.
Yeah.
They need the wooden framing. They need to learn the structured skills of discussion leadership.
That distinction changes everything. It means leaders can pinpoint exactly why a team is failing. And we really need to talk about failure here because the cost of lacking these two keys is brutal.
It really is.
Let's look at the tech sector, which the sources note is famous for something called the brilliance bias.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The brilliance bias. It's a toxic cultural setup where sheer, raw technical intellect is valued above all human interpersonal skills.
So being the smartest person in the room is basically the only currency that matters.
Exactly. And it actively disincentivizes empathy because empathy requires listening, and listening implies you don't already have all the answers. And meeting ignorance in a brilliance bias culture is a huge career vulnerability.
Which is incredibly ironic because Google, arguably the epicenter of the brilliance bias, they ran their famous Project Aristotle to find out what made their best teams work.
Right. And they analyzed everything: education, hobbies, technical prowess.
And they found that psychological safety was the undisputed #1 predictor of team effectiveness. It completely eclipsed individual talent.
It did.
But I have to be honest, I read that and part of me is a little skeptical. I mean, I buy that empathy and discussion leadership are great for software developers arguing over code. But what about when the building is literally on fire?
That's a very fair question.
Right, like in an emergency room or a failing startup running out of cash. Doesn't discussion leadership just slow everything down? Don't you just need a decisive leader to shut down the dialogue and bark orders?
It's a super common assumption. But the data from high-reliability organizations proves the exact opposite. Barking orders in a complex crisis is highly correlated with catastrophic failure.
Wait, really?
Yes. Look at aviation. The National Transportation Safety Board frequently investigates these tragic commercial cockpit accidents where, honestly, the plane was perfectly fine.
Mechanical failure wasn't the issue.
Exactly. The crew crashed a perfectly good airplane anyway. And why? Because the captain barked orders, established a rigid dominance hierarchy.
And the co-pilot was too scared to speak up.
Precisely. The first officer notices a fatal calculation error but doesn't feel safe challenging the captain. A lack of structured cross-checking and discussion leadership literally brings down airplanes.
Because there's no protocol for dissenting. The hierarchy just silences the person with the life-saving information.
Exactly the case. And we see the exact same mechanics in healthcare. The data shows that hospital units with high psychological safety experience 43% fewer medication errors.
Wow, 43%?
Yeah, and 32% fewer patient falls. Structured dialogue-like surgical teams doing mandatory cross-functional pre-op briefings. It doesn't slow down the surgery. It drastically speeds up the accurate completion of the surgery by catching variables the lead surgeon couldn't see.
There's a really counterintuitive paradox in that hospital data, isn't there? The units with the highest psychological safety actually report the highest number of near-miss events.
Yes, the near-miss paradox. To an untrained executive, a highly safe team looks like they're making more mistakes.
Right.
But they aren't making more errors. They're just finally safe enough to disclose the invisible ones. In a low empathy culture, if a nurse almost gives the wrong medication but catches it at the last second, they bury that information in terror.
Of course.
But in safe culture, they report it, which allows the hospital to fix the underlying systemic flaw that caused the near miss in the first place.
And if you don't have that safety, the physical toll on your body is just devastating. The research details how a lack of safety triggers what neuroscientists call a scarf threat.
Yes, the SCARF model.
And this isn't just feeling a little stressed out. SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. When a boss dismisses your idea publicly, your brain doesn't just register it as a rude comment. Your amygdala processes it as a literal survival threat to your social status.
And when the amygdala is hijacked, blood flow is literally diverted away from your prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, problem-solving part of your brain.
So you're thrust into a physiological fight-or-flight state while just sitting at your keyboard.
Exactly. Imagine living in that state for years. A study of 6,000 employees found that poor communication quality at work accurately predicted clinical depression 4 years later.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. The text describes the reality of working for a low-empathy manager as feeling unseen in your strengths and hyper-visible in your mistakes.
Think about your own career for a second to the listener. Have you ever felt that agonizing sensation of constantly monitoring every single word you type in an email or say in a meeting, just waiting for the trapdoor to open beneath you? It grinds you down to nothing.
Which brings us to the inevitable conclusion. Organizations have to fix the emotional foundation first. And to do that, we have to dismantle the most pervasive myth in corporate culture.
That empathy is an innate genetic trait.
Yes, the belief that you're either born with it or you aren't.
Right. How many times have you heard a manager say, well, I'm just a straight shooter, I don't really do the warm and fuzzy stuff, as if that's a valid excuse? We treat empathy like an eye color you inherit, when the reality from the sources is that empathy is a mechanical muscle you can build through reps.
The clinical evidence for this is undeniable. Take the Cleveland Clinic, for example.
Oh, this is a great example.
They recognized that a lack of empathy was tanking their patient satisfaction scores and driving doctor burnout. But they didn't just tell their doctors to care more. That never works.
Right, you can't just mandate feelings.
Exactly. Instead, they broke the abstract emotion of empathy down into trainable physical behaviors. They literally implemented EMPATHY training. They taught their staff exactly where to point their feet during a consultation.
Pointing their
Yeah. They taught them how to soften the specific muscles around their eyes, how to modulate their vocal affect and tone, and how to physically arrange their posture to signal active listening.
They turned an emotion into muscle memory.
And the results were profound. Patient satisfaction regarding communication skyrocketed by 15%. But the truly shocking part was that doctor burnout actually decreased.
Which is counterintuitive, right? We assume that being empathetic drains your battery.
Right. But it turns out that operating in a state of constant defensive detachment is actually far more exhausting.
That makes so much sense. And it isn't just hospitals doing this. Morgan Stanley took this into the notoriously cutthroat world of finance.
Yes, they did.
They rolled out 360-degree feedback loops, specifically targeting empathetic behaviors, and they paired people in peer learning groups. Just by focusing on those mechanics, engagement jumped 12% and voluntary turnover dropped by 8%.
That's huge for finance.
Oh, massively. And over at Microsoft, they use something called empathy mapping, which is a concept pulled from design thinking. When they're rolling out a massive organizational change, they visually map out exactly what their stakeholders will be thinking, feeling, and fearing at every stage. They engineer empathy right into the project plan.
That's brilliant. But we do have to address a severe warning from the data here.
Okay, what's that?
Empathy training fails disastrously if it is treated as a superficial compliance checkbox.
Oh, like a corporate HR mandate?
Exactly. Imagine an organization that runs a mandatory empathy workshop on Friday, but on Monday, the promotion structures still heavily reward cutthroat zero-sum behavior. The training becomes a total joke.
Right.
Even more dangerously, if you successfully train leaders to be empathetic, employees finally feel safe enough to bare their souls and voice their systemic problems.
But then leadership takes zero structural action to fix those problems.
Yes, and that breeds a deeply toxic cynicism. People feel manipulated. Empathy without structural action is really just emotional voyeurism.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that is exactly where the wooden framing comes in. Once you have a team that feels deeply heard, the floodgates open, right? Everyone is talking, ideas are bouncing around everywhere.
Right.
How do you prevent that from devolving into total chaos? Well, you need the architecture of discussion leadership.
And leading organizations are treating this architecture like a core competency. Look at Airbnb. A few years ago, they realized their highly empathetic, collaborative culture was actually paralyzing them.
Wait, really? Being too collaborative?
Yeah. Everyone wanted to be heard, so reaching a consensus was agonizingly slow. But their solution wasn't to stop listening. It was to train leaders in specialized facilitation mechanics. They taught them how to sharply frame a question, how to probe hidden assumptions, and how to sequence a conversation.
And the result?
After implementing that discussion leadership, those teams generated 35% more actionable ideas and made decisions 20% faster.
They actually sped up by adding structure.
Ex-
IDEO, the legendary design firm, does something very similar. They banish questions like, can we fix this? Because, can we invites a binary yes or no, and it usually triggers a defensive list of reasons why it's too hard.
Right, it shuts the brain down.
Yes. So instead, they force the use of the phrase, how might we? Like, how might we fix this? It assumes the solution exists in the room and challenges the group's cognitive architecture to find it.
And we can see this structural intervention in pharmaceuticals, too. Novartis was bleeding talent due to massive burnout, and they traced the root cause directly to their chaotic, unstructured meetings.
Bad meetings are the worst.
The worst. So they mandated rigid pre-meeting clarity. If you wanted to hold a meeting, you had to provide a maximum 2-page pre-read. You had to explicitly define the decision rights, like who actually had the power to make the call.
Nice.
And you had to open with a mandatory check-in to gauge the psychological state of the room. Meeting effectiveness jumped 40% simply by forcing discussion leadership onto the calendar.
I am so fascinated by the specific frameworks the research highlights for this. There's a methodology mentioned called liberating structures, and one of their core tools is called 1-2-4-all.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah, think about a standard brainstorming meeting. The boss or the loudest extrovert speaks first, and immediately the entire room unconsciously anchors to that idea. Groupthink sets in instantly.
Right.
The 1-2-4-all method prevents that structurally. First, you get 1 minute of total silence for individual reflection. Then, you discuss your idea with a partner for 2 minutes. Then, 2 pairs merge into foursomes for 4 minutes. And finally, the best ideas are brought to the whole group.
It's brilliant.
You physically engineer the conversation so the quietest introvert has the exact same structural power as the loudest VP. Toyota does something similar with their 5 Whys method, using it as structured discussion leadership for the front line.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what we're really talking about is what organizational psychologist Edgar Schein called humble inquiry.
Humble inquiry.
Right. Discussion leadership is the fine art of asking rather than telling. You're managing the energy flow. You're deliberately sequencing the group from divergent thinking, where you're safely gathering all the wild, opposing ideas, to convergent thinking, where you're synthesizing those ideas down into a sharp, actionable decision. So if you're sitting at a chaotic Monday morning meeting right now, that's how you structure it without sounding like you're taking over.
But how do you make this permanent? We've poured the concrete, we've built the framing, but how do organizations keep this house from rotting over time?
Well, the research points to a few pillars of systemic integration, and the first is leader vulnerability.
Okay.
Satya Nadella is the textbook example here. When he took over Microsoft, they had a vicious know-it-all culture. He actively transformed it into a learn-it-all culture by standing in front of his executives and openly saying, I don't know the answer to that.
Wow.
He even shared his personal struggles raising a son with severe disabilities to model that empathy was a strategic priority. Pixar does this too, with their Brain Trust, where incredibly successful directors are forced to sit in a room and receive blunt, unvarnished feedback from their peers while remaining totally non-defensive.
Okay. It sounds ideal, but I need to push back on this vulnerability mandate for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Because I hear this all the time on professional networks. Leaders must be vulnerable. But let's be incredibly real for a second. If you're a middle manager in a hyper-competitive, toxic finance firm, and you walk into a board meeting and announce, I am struggling and I don't know what I'm doing.
You're not going to inspire psychological safety.
No, you're going to get fired. Isn't vulnerability a massive, dangerous career risk?
It is a profound risk, yes. And it's vital to understand the concept of bounded vulnerability. The data does not suggest you should treat your team like your therapist or constantly profess incompetence.
Okay, good.
Appropriate vulnerability is strategic. It's saying, I have absolute confidence in our ultimate goal, but I am uncertain about this specific Q3 tactic. Who sees a blind spot I am missing? You're acknowledging a limitation to explicitly grant others permission to voice their own concerns.
Right.
But your pushback hits on a darker truth in the text. In a truly toxic environment where psychological safety violations are rampant, empathy training is essentially useless. You cannot train your way out of systemic abuse. That requires a complete restructuring of power and accountability at the highest levels.
Yeah, you can't put a Band-Aid on a systemic tumor.
Um,
But assuming the culture is simply underdeveloped rather than truly toxic, the next pillar to make it stick is measurement.
yes.
The Boston Consulting Group deployed a team effectiveness diagnostic that proved this. When teams were given raw data on their own psychological safety metrics and forced to act on it, their performance scores improved by 28%.
While teams that ignore the data only improved by 8%.
Exactly. Kaiser Permanente even uses an anonymous safety check system to flag units with deteriorating communication long before a medical error actually occurs. It acts as an early warning radar.
And you must pair that measurement with distributed capability. You cannot have a team's entire psychological safety rely on a single charismatic manager.
Because what happens when that manager goes on vacation or takes a new job? The whole system collapses.
Exactly. Anerup, the global engineering firm, solved this by building skills networks where anyone at any level can be trained in facilitation. Atlassian open-sourced a team playbook so the mechanics of discussion leadership are available to every single employee. They democratized the toolkit.
Which naturally drives the final pillar, continuous learning. When you distribute these skills, you stop having ego-driven debates and start having integrated conversations. Roche Pharmaceuticals used cross-functional dialogue protocols to stop their scientists and business units from fighting, and it actually shortened their drug development timelines by 20%. And the U.S. military institutionalized this with the after-action review. After every single mission, regardless of rank, they sit down and ask, what did we intend to happen? What actually happened? Why was there a gap? And what will we do differently tomorrow?
Those continuous conversational learning cycles are the literal engine of organizational resilience. The companies that treat their communication architecture with the exact same rigor, funding, and measurement as their IT infrastructure or their financial supply chains, they are the ones who will simply outpace their competitors. It's a structural advantage.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring this home for the listener. The core insight from this deep dive into Dr. Westover's research is that communication is absolutely not a soft skill. It is the most critical, highly complex infrastructure your team possesses.
Without a doubt.
Empathy provides the relational warmth. It pours the concrete foundation so people feel physically and psychologically safe enough to exist without armor. Discussion leadership provides the cognitive scaffolding. It builds the framing so that when people do finally speak up, the conversation is engineered to produce innovation rather than chaos.
Together, they create teams that don't just survive a rapidly changing world. They actively design it. It just requires a shift in daily habits.
Right.
It means recognizing that every single calendar invite, every quick check-in, is an opportunity to practice humble inquiry, to validate a colleague's hidden expertise, and to strategically sequence a better outcome.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, expanding on a brief concept in the research known as work-family spillover.
Oh, this is a great point.
We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing corporate workspaces, hospitals, and high-stakes boardrooms. But if empathy and discussion leadership are the literal structural mechanics of how humans adapt and connect, what happens if you apply these exact frameworks to your family dinners? Or to how your friend group navigates a major conflict? Are you the discussion leader in your own living room? Because at the end of the day, whether you're managing a global supply chain or just sitting at a kitchen table, you do not want the people you care about to be part of that 70% silently biting their tongues.
That is a phenomenal lens to view our own lives through.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden architecture of how we connect. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep practicing that discussion leadership, and most importantly, keep learning.